The truck stop sat on the outskirts of town, a beacon of rest for weary travelers and long-haul drivers. A single diner stood at its heart, Carter's Pit Stop, a place where the smell of sizzling bacon mixed with the diesel fumes of the idling rigs parked outside. The neon sign above the diner flickered, casting an amber glow against the darkening sky. Inside, the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clatter of silverware filled the space, providing a comforting sense of normalcy. Truckers, locals, and a few lone travelers occupied the red vinyl booths, some chatting over steaming cups of coffee, others focused on their meals. Outside, the vast highway stretched endlessly in both directions. The distant sound of engines rumbling on the open road was a constant companion to those who lived by the asphalt. Despite its isolation, the truck stop was a safe haven, until that safety was shattered. Behind the counter, Emma Carter moved swiftly, balancing 2 plates in one hand while refilling a customer's coffee with the other. At just 22, she had already learned the value of hard work. The truck stop had been in her family for years, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was home. Emma had grown up around truckers, learning to navigate their gruff manners and quick tempers with ease. She was used to handling difficult customers, but she also knew when someone crossed the line. Her father, Jack, had raised her to be tough, to stand her ground, but some men didn't take well to a woman who refused to be intimidated. Jack Carter had spent years serving his country as a Navy SEAL before retiring to a quieter life on the road. He now drove long hauls, enjoying the solitude of the highway and the sense of purpose that came with keeping America's supply chain moving. Despite his graying hair, Jack was still built like a soldier, broad shoulders, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a quiet intensity that commanded respect. Most people had no idea about his past, and that was how he liked it. But Jack was more than just a trucker. He was a protector, and anyone who dared threaten his daughter was making a grave mistake. Then there was them. A notorious biker gang, led by a man named Vince, had been making their presence known in small towns along the highway. They rode into places like a storm, taking what they wanted and leaving behind fear in their wake. Vince was a man who thrived on intimidation. His gang respected him out of fear rather than loyalty. They knew he was unpredictable, violent, and above all, remorseless. To him, places like this truck stop were easy prey. No one ever stood up to them, at least, not for long. It started with the distant roar of engines. The low, guttural growl of motorcycles rolling in shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the truck stop. One by one, the bikes pulled into the lot, their chrome bodies gleaming under the flickering neon lights. Inside the diner, conversations hushed. Forks froze mid-air. The regulars knew trouble had arrived. The front door swung open with force, and Vince stepped inside, flanked by half a dozen of his men. They walked with the arrogance of men who had never been told no. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and the smell of engine oil and cheap whiskey clung to them like a second skin. Emma felt the shift in the air immediately. She was used to dealing with difficult customers, but these men were different. They weren't here for a meal or a quick rest. They were here to remind the world that they owned it. Vince strolled up to the counter and leaned in with a smirk. "Hey there, sweetheart," he drawled. "Why don't you be a doll and get me a beer?" Emma kept her expression neutral. "We don't serve alcohol here." Vince chuckled, shaking his head. "That's so. Well, maybe you can find something to keep me happy, huh?" His gang laughed, and one of them muttered something crude under his breath. Emma ignored it. "Coffee," she offered, keeping her voice even. Vince stared at her for a long moment, then grinned. "Sure, why not? But make it quick, sweetheart. I'm not a patient man." Emma turned to pour the coffee, her hands steady despite the tension thickening in the air. She could feel their eyes on her, predatory, testing. As she set the cup down in front of Vince, he knocked it over with a deliberate flick of his wrist. The dark liquid spread across the counter, dripping onto the floor. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Looks like I made a mess. Be a good girl and clean it up." The diner was silent. Every trucker in the room watched, but none of them moved. They all knew the reputation of Vince's gang, and none of them wanted to be the one to start trouble. Emma clenched her jaw. She wasn't a fool. She knew these men were dangerous, but she also knew that giving in to them would only encourage them further. With a calm she didn't quite feel, she grabbed a rag and wiped the counter clean. Vince smirked. "Good girl." Emma turned to walk away, but Vince grabbed her wrist. The moment. His fingers wrapped around her arm. The tension in the diner snapped. Emma yanked her arm back, her voice steady but firm. "Let go." Vince laughed. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't be like that." She took a step back, eyes narrowing. "You need to leave." The gang burst into laughter, but Vince wasn't amused. His grip tightened. The truckers still sat frozen, unwilling to get involved. The bikers owned this moment, until Emma spoke her next words. "You don't want to do this," she said evenly. "My father won't like it." Vince raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah. And who's your daddy, sweetheart?" A deep voice cut through the silence from the diner entrance. "That would be me." Jack Carter stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze locking onto Vince. The air changed instantly. The bikers might not have known who Jack was, but they were about to find out. The tension in Carter's pit stop didn't fade after Jack's arrival. It only simmered beneath the surface. Vince and his gang weren't the type to back down easily. Emma could feel it, the way they lingered, the way their laughter had a sharp edge to it now. They weren't done. The gang spread out, claiming the diner as their own. One of them kicked a chair aside with a loud scrape. Another ran a dirty hand along the counter, knocking over a napkin holder. A third stepped deliberately into Emma's path as she moved between tables, forcing her to stop. Vince leaned back against a booth, stretching his arms across the seat. His smirk was lazy, but his eyes were full of malice. "You know," he mused, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've been thinking, truckers, they're a dying breed. Weak men. Pathetic, really. And their families, even weaker." Emma clenched her fists. Vince tilted his head, watching her reaction like a predator testing its prey. "What do you think, sweetheart? That sound about right?" Emma refused to give him the satisfaction of an answer. She turned on her heel and walked toward the back, pulling her phone from her apron pocket. She dialed her father. No answer. Her stomach tightened. He was still on the road. She could handle herself. She always had. But something about the way Vince was watching her, the way the other bikers prowled around the diner like they owned it, something told her this was different. An hour later, headlights cut through the night as Jack Carter's semi pulled into the lot. Jack stepped out of his rig, rolling his shoulders and stretching his back. Long-haul driving had its tolls, but nothing compared to the exhaustion he used to feel after days in enemy territory. He was home. The truck stop had always been more than just a business. It was where he belonged, and most importantly, it was where Emma was. He walked into the diner, the familiar scent of coffee and grilled food greeting him. But something was off. Emma stood behind the counter, a tight smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was good at masking emotions, but not from him. Jack's gaze swept the room. The truckers were quiet, keeping their heads down. The air was thick with unspoken tension. And then he saw them, the bikers. They were spread out, taking up space in a way that wasn't just casual. It was a display of control, dominance. Jack had seen men like this before. He'd dealt with them his whole life, on the battlefield, in war zones, in places where respect was earned, not demanded. He exhaled slowly and walked to the counter. "Hey, kid," he greeted Emma, his voice warm. Emma smiled, this time a little more genuine. "Hey, Dad. Long trip?" Jack nodded. "Not bad. Good to be home." She poured him a fresh cup of coffee, but he could feel the tension in her every movement. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Emma hesitated, just for a second. Then she shrugged. "Yeah, just a long day." Jack studied her. She was protecting him, just like he'd always taught her to protect herself. But Jack didn't miss details, and he didn't ignore instincts. Something wasn't right. Vince watched the exchange with amusement. "Cute," he drawled, pushing himself off the booth and swaggering toward the counter. "So, this is the great protector, huh? The trucker who raised our little waitress here." Jack didn't look up from his coffee. He took a slow sip, then set the mug down carefully. Vince leaned closer. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Jack finally glanced at him. His expression didn't change. No anger, no fear. Just quiet assessment. Vince hated that. One of the bikers chuckled. "Looks like retirement's been rough on ya, Pops." Vince smirked. "Yeah, no surprise there. Truckers, man. Bunch of washed-up has-beens with no fight left in 'em." Jack said nothing. He simply smiled, slow and easy, then took another sip of coffee. That smile did something to the gang. It unsettled them. They were used to people reacting to their threats. Anger, fear, submission. But this was different. One of the bikers, a stocky man with tattoos snaking up his arms, lost patience. "Let's see if he's still got any fight left." He moved fast, shoving Jack's shoulder, expecting the older man to stumble. Jack didn't. Instead, with barely a shift in weight, he stepped aside, fluid, controlled. The biker's momentum carried him forward, off balance. Jack watched him regain his footing, amusement flickering in his sharp eyes. That was the first moment the bikers felt it. Something off about this man. Vince's smirk faltered for a split second. "You think you're funny?" Jack finally set his coffee down. He stretched his fingers, tilting his head slightly as if considering something. Then, in a voice calm as the eye of a storm, he said, "I think you should walk away." Silence. The truckers who had been pretending not to watch definitely heard that. Vince chuckled, but there was an edge to it now. "Oh yeah, and what if we don't?" Jack exhaled, slow and steady. He looked at Vince for a long moment. Then he said, with absolute certainty, "Then you won't be walking at all." The room was dead quiet. The truckers had seen fights before. They had seen posturing, seen brawls break out over insults, seen tough guys try to prove themselves. But this wasn't that. Jack Carter wasn't posturing. He was making a promise. And suddenly, Vince and his gang weren't so sure if they wanted to find out what happened when a man like Jack Carter made a promise. Vince had been pushing boundaries all night, but now he crossed one. Emma tried to step past him, her patience long gone. She wasn't afraid of these guys, and she wasn't about to let them ruin her night any further. But Vince wasn't done playing. His hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. Not just a playful grab, a grip, a show of control. Emma's breath hitched. The diner's background noise, chatter, the hum of the coffee machine, the soft clang of silverware, vanished into silence. Jack had been watching everything, calculating, waiting, and in that moment, something shifted. His posture didn't change. He didn't make a sound, but the air in the room changed. Every trucker, every patron, everyone felt it. The easygoing, road-worn trucker who had walked in minutes ago was gone. Jack Carter, the man who had spent decades in war zones, the man trained to neutralize threats before they even knew they were threats, was awake now, and he was looking at Vince. Vince barely had time to blink before it happened. Jack's arm shot forward in a blur. A single movement, clean, practiced, lethal. Vince's wrist twisted backward, forcing his fingers to snap open. Before he could react, Jack's other hand clamped around the back of his neck and slammed him down onto the counter. The entire diner jumped at the sound. Vince gasped, his free hand scrambling for balance. His face was pressed against the cold surface, his own reflection staring back at him in the polished chrome. Jack leaned in. His voice, low and calm, sent ice down Vince's spine. "That was your one mistake." The other bikers shot up from their seats. Chairs scraped. Boots thudded against the floor. One of them, Rico, a towering brute with a shaved head, lunged. Jack pivoted smoothly, releasing Vince and dropping under Rico's attack in the same breath. A quick twist. Jack's arm shot up and hooked under Rico's massive forearm, yanking him forward. The biker's own momentum betrayed him. He crashed hard against a booth, wheezing as Jack drove an elbow into his ribs. Another came at him, a wiry guy with a blade. Jack didn't flinch. He stepped into the attack. His hand snatched the biker's wrist mid-swing, twisting it in a way the human body was never meant to bend. The knife clattered to the floor. A heartbeat later, Jack drove his knee into the biker's stomach, sending him collapsing onto the tile, gasping for air. It wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a messy bar fight with wild punches and chaos. It was surgical, controlled, precise, efficient. Jack Carter didn't fight like a trucker defending his daughter. He fought like a man trained to end wars. And the bikers, who had spent their lives intimidating others, who had always been the threat, were utterly unprepared. Vince groaned, pushing himself up from the counter. His nose was bleeding, and humiliation burned in his chest. He turned to Jack, fury in his eyes. "What the hell are you?" he spat, clutching his wrist where Jack had twisted it. A voice from the back of the diner, an older trucker who had been quietly watching, answered before Jack could. "That's Jack Carter," the man said, his voice carrying through the silence. A pause. Then, soft, almost reverent, "Navy SEAL." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The bikers froze. Vince's breath caught in his throat. Jack Carter. The name meant something. The gang had spent their lives thriving on fear, but this was different. This wasn't fear of getting caught or losing a fight. This was the fear of standing across from a predator when you realized you were the prey. Jack didn't move. He just watched them, silent, waiting. The message was clear. Do you really want to keep going? The bikers, who moments ago had seemed so untouchable, so powerful, now looked like nothing. Their entire world had just shifted. They hadn't just messed with the wrong trucker. They had messed with the wrong man. The once rowdy gang was now a broken mess, their arrogance shattered along with their pride. Vince clutched his wrist, still reeling from Jack's precision takedown. Rico groaned as he staggered to his feet, still gasping for breath. The others, once so eager to prove their dominance, now limped toward the exit, too humiliated to look anyone in the eye. Jack didn't chase them. He didn't need to. Instead, He stood there, watching them crawl out of the diner, his expression unreadable. The message had been sent loud and clear. This truck stop was off limits. Just as Vince reached the door, he turned back, his face twisted with anger. "You don't know who you just messed with, old man," he spat. Jack took a slow step forward. His gaze alone was enough to make Vince shrink back. "I know exactly who I just dealt with," Jack said, his voice dangerously calm. "A bunch of cowards who thought they could bully my daughter. And now, you're nothing." The finality of those words hit harder than any punch. The gang slunk away into the night, their motorcycles roaring to life as they sped off down the highway. The silence in the diner was deafening. Then, cheers. Truckers pounded their fists on the tables, some laughing, others shaking their heads in awe. The cook peered out from the kitchen, grinning. Even the old man at the counter, who hadn't spoken all night, gave Jack an approving nod. Justice had been served. Jack exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Well," he muttered, turning back to Emma. "That was a bit more excitement than I planned for tonight." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart still pounding. "Dad," she said, shaking her head, "you really know how to make an impression." After the rush of the moment faded, reality set in. Emma turned to Jack, concern flickering in her eyes. "You didn't have to do that, you know," she said quietly. Jack arched a brow. "You wanted me to just let them walk all over you?" "No, of course not." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "But I know who you are, what you're capable of. And I don't want you to have to keep fighting every battle that comes my way." Jack studied her for a moment, then placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Emma," he said gently, "I fought in wars. I faced enemies who were trained, ruthless, and armed to the teeth. These guys, they were a minor inconvenience." Emma sighed, shaking her head. "Maybe to you, but to me, I just worry, you know? You don't have to protect me forever." Jack smiled. "I know, but tonight, I did what any father would do." Her heart softened. She knew he was right. Jack turned toward the truckers still gathered in the diner. The energy in the room had shifted, not just relief, but something more. "These guys have been harassing this town for a long time," one of the older truckers muttered. "Nobody ever did anything about it." Jack took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. "Bullies only have power when people let them," he said, his voice steady. "They push, and when nobody pushes back, they think they own the place." The truckers nodded, some murmuring in agreement. Jack set his cup down and looked around the room. "Next time trouble comes rolling in, you don't wait for someone like me to step in. You stand together. You don't let them take control." The men exchanged glances. A newfound determination settled over them. The old man at the counter smirked. "Well, if they ever do come back," he said, "we'll be ready." Jack gave a small nod of approval. As Emma looked around the room, at the truckers who now stood a little taller, a little stronger, she realized something. Her father wasn't just protecting her tonight. He had changed everyone in that diner, and for the first time in a long time, the truck stop felt truly safe. The truck stop had returned to what it was meant to be, a place of rest, not fear. Days passed, and the bikers never returned. Rumors spread that Vince and his gang had skipped town entirely, too ashamed to show their faces after what had happened. Some said they tried causing trouble elsewhere, only to be met with resistance from people who had heard about the night they were humiliated by a single truck driver. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. Jack Carter had sent a message that would not be forgotten. The evening air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of highway traffic as Emma and Jack sat outside the diner, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, casting a warm glow over the truck stop. Emma sighed, resting her chin on her palm. "You know," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "I never used to think much about sunsets. Just another part of the day." Jack glanced at her, amused. "And now," she said, "they remind me that no matter what happens, we'll always find peace again." Jack nodded, taking in the sight before them. "Resilience," he murmured. "That's what life's all about." Emma turned to him. "Are you ever going to slow down? Stop driving, stop moving?" Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe one day. But for now, the road's still calling." Emma smirked. "Well, just try not to take down any more gangs on your way, okay?" Jack grinned. "No promises." They sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the stillness, the quiet strength that had settled over the truck stop. Tonight, there was no danger, no fear, just a father and daughter side by side, unshaken, unbroken, and ready for whatever came next.